All right, well, I know we will have people kind of joining on a rolling measure right now as it is, getting to the lunch hour. People are ending meetings and getting settled to join. My name is Allison Hahn. I'm the Executive Director of Grow North, and we were happy to partner with AURI to put this event on today. We also had a ton of others who are going to be speaking, who are instrumental in getting the content together for this. For those of you who don't know, Grow North is kind of the convener, resource aggregator, and connector for all food and agriculture startups in Minnesota. So if you have a startup and you need help and need connection and need resources, please reach out to us. We're happy to connect you to who we can, and we are happy to provide educational content like this monthly. And in the next few months, you'll have to gear up. We have our annual Food Ag Ideas Week, which will be December 3rd through 10th. So we'll be releasing information and registration for that in the coming weeks. So really excited to get that going. But now I'm going to take it and turn it over to our fearless leader at AUR, Jason Robinson, who will give you a rundown of what to expect for today. And we will go from there. Take it away, Jason.
Thank you, Allison. And just to make sure, you are at a Sustainable Packaging in Your Brand Strategies and Considerations webinar, just to make sure you never want to get on the wrong plane, right? So I wanted to start with just a very brief intro of who I am and who AURI is, and then we'll kick it off into the agenda. So like Allison said, my name is Jason Robinson. I'm a business development director for our food practice at the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute. AURI is a 30-year-old nonprofit corp that was created by the Minnesota State Legislature to support farmers in enhancing the utilization of their agricultural products. We provide technical support services to help commercialize these products that are made out of the agricultural products from Minnesota, all in the effort of transforming these products into sustainable businesses. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get going? First of all, this session is really meant to build on and be a companion to the packaging guide for scaling food businesses that's available for free at auri.org. The link is available on your Eventbrite description. That packaging guide is intended to provide a baseline of knowledge for small businesses in selecting packaging as they develop their products for commercialization. This session is a continuation of what we started in that guidebook, really focused on helping businesses to better understand and get smarter about making more sustainable packaging choices for your business. And you can see this in the agenda that we put together today with our esteemed speakers. In the first module, our goal is to talk a little bit about what sustainable packaging actually is. What are the categories? How should you be thinking about more sustainable packaging? In module 2, we want to be able to take you through the considerations and trade-offs in making that packaging choice. What should you be thinking about beyond the fact that you might just be interested in going to a compostable package, for instance? In module 3, we're going to talk about actually measuring that environmental impact. How do you use a tool called life cycle analysis to understand the actual impact, the measurable environmental impact of your packaging choice? From there, we'll move into general Q&A, and then we'll finish off by sending you to the breakout rooms that you selected during the registration process for additional Q&A with our speakers. If you are no longer interested in the breakout room that you originally signed up for, please feel free to contact Allison through the chat function, and we will get you reassigned to the breakout room you're most interested in. We'll post those a little bit later. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Please feel free to use the chat function to post questions, but we'll ask you to keep your mic off during the presentation. We have a lot of content and will not stop for questions until Q&A time. We'll do our best to answer those during the session, during the general Q&A. Otherwise, we'll ask the presenters to respond to those questions in the chat itself, if there are specific questions, or during the breakout room Q&A. Also, please be respectful and avoid in-depth conversations in the chat to minimize distractions during the session. And if you have any comments, please send those directly to Allison, who will also be moderating the chat. And finally, note that we will be moving quickly during this session, and we may need to move on to the next module before it seems as if it's complete. So fair warning to the speakers, I might cut you off. And again, just a reminder, please keep your mics off. So with that, let's go ahead and get going. Our first module is focused on really delivering the basics around more sustainable packaging. This module was developed by Dr. Claire Sand and Joel Schmidt. Briefly, Dr. Claire Sand is the owner of Packaging Technology and Research and Gazelle Mobile Packaging. Dr. Sand has 30+ years of experience in the food packaging industry and academia, and is an adjunct professor at Cal Poly, Michigan State, and the University of Minnesota. Joel Schmidt is the Director of Sales for ePac's Minneapolis and Madison facilities. ePac is a packaging organization that is built to supply packaging, flexible packaging to small businesses using digital printing technology. Joel has spent his entire career in paper, cartons, labels, and flexible packaging, and is well versed in the many complex issues that factor into sustainable packaging solutions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joel. So Joel, take it away.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate the introduction and appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today on sustainable packaging. As I'm sure most of you are aware, it can be a very complex and intimidating topic. Easily can get confused and lost in a lot of the details, but our goal here today is really to try to take a high-level overview and introduce you to the main concepts and ideas that you should be considering as you think about how you might introduce more sustainable packaging with your brand. So on this first slide here, we basically introduced 3 buckets or 3 topics that we want to cover today in our brief session. The first of that is around sustainable sourcing. And we look at where do the packaging raw materials come from? Not only just the primary packaging, whether it's glass or metal or films, but also the inks and the coatings and the other ingredients that go into making up your overall packaging. Things that you should consider from the sourcing side. In the second category, then we'll look at the end-of-life options. So after the packaging has served its purpose and protected your product and delivered it to the consumer, conveyed your brand image, your brand story, what is a consumer supposed to do with that package? And how do we make that easy and provide options for them so that it's not just going into the landfill? And then the third category that we want to touch on, first and foremost, the packaging serves a functional purpose. It needs to protect your product inside of that package. And we want to make sure that we're minimizing any spoilage or waste that might occur to that product. And at the same time, make sure that we're minimizing the amount of packaging we're using to accomplish that purpose. So when we talk about sustainable packaging, we really do take a look at the overall value chain and look at it as a circular process. If we start over on the right-hand side from the sourcing side of things, as I mentioned, we get into issues like raw material extraction or usage of post-consumer materials, items that have been recycled and returned into the value stream to be reused once again. As we continue around the circle, there are many steps that go into converting a package. It may touch many different companies to provide the exact package that you're looking for, go into food manufacturers, co-packagers, co-manufacturers, and through the distribution cycle. And that's where we have to really understand what the supply chain is going to challenge your product with to make sure that our packaging is designed to hold up to those challenges. And then once we get around the circle over to the food retail side, again, the primary purpose there being the conveying of your brand message, selling the product to the consumer, attracting their attention. And as we close the loop, really looking for ways that we can communicate to the consumer what that packaging material is made of and what they can do with that package after it's served its initial purpose, if there is a way to recycle that, and how to communicate that or how to achieve that goal. So let's take a little closer look at sustainable sourcing and start diving into a couple of the key phrases and topics that you might want to consider as you look at potentially changing your packaging or looking for more sustainable packaging. First, on the left-hand side, we talk about where the material came from. So biomass derived. Is it a tree or a crop that's grown, a renewable resource that can be planted and grown over and over? You know, so your paper-based packaging materials, your cartons, your corrugate containers, any of your fiber molded type packaging options would utilize those fiber sources that are renewable. So certainly one aspect to look at there. There are also some plastics that come from renewable sources. It can get a little complicated, but some of those are converted into unique plastics. PLA is an example, coming from a corn-based source. And other options are available, some sugarcane derived materials that are actually converted into conventional polyethylene materials and then converted further into films and pouches. So there are a variety of options that can come from that biomass derived side. Alternatively, when you look at packaging materials such as metal cans or glass jars, we're talking about raw materials that are extracted from the earth, whether they're fossil derived or mineral based, and those are non-renewable. So they tend to have a little bit higher recyclability, and Claire will cover that in her slides coming up. But it's a one-time extraction from the earth, and it's a very long-term or impossible process to replace those and regenerate those raw materials on a quick basis. So those cover the left-hand side. And as I mentioned, you know, then we also need to consider the virgin content versus using recycled materials. And do we have the infrastructure in place and the supply of clean recycled material that can be utilized in food packaging and be still food safe? And many of those packaging formats do indeed have clean sources, but definitely an area where there is an opportunity for more investment and more innovation to continue to provide those options of recycled content. More recently, probably have heard of some ideas of being able to reuse packaging. Loop is an example of a program where they're using durable packaging containers that can be used over and over, and the cycle is put in place for drop off and pickup of those containers and the cleaning of them to be safe to reuse a second or a third time. If we go to the next slide. So once you take a look at that first level of where is the material coming from, then we need to start looking at what are the factors that come into play as to how those materials are harvested or extracted, and what is the impact overall on our environment. So that environmental box on the left-hand side, there are different ways of which materials are extracted. Some are more energy intensive than others, and that can contribute then to some of the other issues of greenhouse gas emissions, for example. If we're using a lot of energy that may be coal-based versus natural gas-based, will impact the level of emissions that are going into our atmosphere. Eutrophication is a fancy word for impact to our waterways, and very specifically runoff of fertilizers and chemicals that we might be putting on our land to help improve the yield of crops that are grown. So we certainly need to look at sustainable farming or forestry practices and make sure that we're not impacting our waterways. Biodiversity is a big factor that may come up in the fiber-based packaging industries when we're logging and removing acres of forest land, and doing that in a way to try to minimize the impact to the wildlife that lives in that forest area. And then also impacts to soil erosion that can occur whether from forestry practices or from crops that we grow. So all of these are considerations that come into play. And I guess the main issue here is that there isn't one perfect type of packaging for any given product, but there are many puts and takes that need to be considered, and many different levels of how those factors come into play depending on the region of where those resources are being grown or harvested as well. On the social side, certainly we want to make sure that our food supply is secure and safe for human consumption. We need to look at the impact to local or indigenous communities as we may change the diversity of the environment around those communities. Occupational health and safety factors come into play in our manufacturing plants. Water management we touched on, not only from the chemical aspect of chemicals getting into our water, but how we actually use that water and return it back to the environment in our manufacturing processes. Chemical use is certainly a factor that comes into play too, with some of the coatings that we might put into our packaging for various purposes, for barrier properties or for various aesthetics that we want to introduce for the brand image. So certainly need to consider and take a look at those factors. Labor rights issues as well, oftentimes more so associated with items that are sourced from third world countries, and making sure that they are brought into the market without use of child labor or damaging the folks there. So many different things to consider. As I said, it can be complex, but that's where your packaging suppliers can certainly help you to understand the key issues that might impact the specific type of packaging that you are considering. So I'm going to hand it over to Claire here for covering the disposal side of things.
Thanks, Joel. That was a wonderful job covering that. It's a complex area and fantastically done. So let's talk about the disposal of packaging. The challenge for us in industry is to enable our customers and our consumers to dispose of packaging wisely. And the fun part of it is we can really do this with packaging design and innovation. So let's just talk through the options and then the differences between them. A lot of these we're familiar with. Landfilling, for example, was very prevalent in the hometown that I grew up with. A golf course is now on the site of a former landfill. Basically it varies from country to country. There are some countries with lots of space, and there are others that are sort of landlocked, Japan being a good example. So the use of landfills is quite low in Japan, but very high in the United States. The important thing about landfills is that they do release methane, and there are different types of landfills these days. Some of them release methane, and some of them just kind of entomb the product. Waste to energy is increasing, and that's pretty interesting. So one of the areas within the waste to energy is syngas, and that's really getting the energy from waste. So for example, plastic has more BTUs than paper. And so in some cases, if the plastic isn't recyclable or reusable or another more sustainable means of disposal, we can, in a sense, burn it and get a lot of energy from that plastic. Incineration is just burning it with no waste to energy. Reuse it, Joel talked about a lot. I saw reusable packaging quite a bit in other countries, and regionally, this is making a major resurgence. Oregon bottlers, for example, of beer have joined together, and I think there's about 7 of them, and they share the same bottles, and then they reuse them regionally. It has been an issue with glass in the past, just because glass is so heavy. There's some other fun things we can do with reuse. For example, Henry Ford famously used the seat cushion. For the seat cushion, he used the inner packaging or the cushioning within a package, and then he used the outer crates, the wood crates, for floorboards on his cars. So all sorts of fun things we can do. Litter, we know about, and not a great use of packaging. Biodegradability, we'll talk just a little bit about. This needs to be done in a very safe environment with very safe packaging. ASTM and EN standards need to be followed, and they measure basically down to about 2 millimeters in size, and they measure the CO2 released to ensure that degradation is complete. There are very specific regulations on toxins that may well be released from the packaging, and we need to make sure that those toxins are not released in an uncontrolled environment. For that reason, and a lot of other reasons, we don't have backyard compostable packaging, nor do we have marine compostable packaging, because that's a very uncontrolled environment. Composting sites are growing in the US and certainly globally, but they do have restrictions in the amount of packaging they can handle to ensure that the mix is correct for degradation. One of the neat areas in that is biodigesters. They use a lot of energy, though, to turn packaging into compost. And sometimes we find that we can reuse it, recycle it, and all sorts of other things, and then eventually put it in a biodigester. Recycling is pretty common outside the United States. Recycling rates of plastic bottles and other types of packaging reach 75 to 90%. We're not so good at it in the US, but there's a glimmer of hope because we know it's possible because other countries really do it well. This is some quick examples that you guys can go through later on, but this is an example of biomass derived. So this is not fossil. These products are not, they look like plastics, but they are plastics, but they're bio-derived. They're not fossil derived, and they're also recyclable. The last section, because I do not want to be guilty of being behind schedule, this is a glimpse of the food industry. On the top, we have food waste, and on the bottom, we have packaging waste. There's just a few points I want to make here. Optimal packaging really reduces food waste. Food waste, for most categories, has a much higher environmental impact than packaging waste. One of the things you'll hear about throughout this talk is the United Nations Strategic Development Targets, and Target 12 is one that links food waste and packaging waste. And brands and retailers have major initiatives on this Target 12. The two are combined when food goes bad. So if we look to the far right, we see distribution, retail, and consumers. Wow, bad food, right? When food goes bad, is often not removed from the packaging. So we see huge amounts of packaging waste and huge amounts of food waste. We can really address that if we use packaging that protects food and doesn't cause food waste, because then the food and the packaging won't get discarded. We typically see this with unsaleables at retail and in distribution, and of course by consumers. So we need to make sure the packaging protects the food and enables consumers and customers, such as companies that buy ingredients or restaurants who buy packaged foods, such as fruits and vegetables, to dispose of the packaging properly. We've made a lot of progress in industry and packaging, and we hope you enjoyed this overview and can help us be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Nice job on timing, right where we need to be. Appreciate it. So with that, what we'll do is we will move into the next module. Our second module is focused on understanding the trade-offs associated with a brand's transition to more sustainable packaging. This module was developed by Dave Miller and Sarah Wangler. Dave Miller is the Vice President of the food business at Clutch Performance, a Minneapolis-based hybrid agency focused on the food and agriculture industry. Dave's career is rooted in leading marketing strategy for several leading CPG, private label, and grocery brands. Sarah is a food marketing professional that specializes in branding, food packaging, and digital marketing. She is the founder and owner of a slender produce marketing firm, Sweet Marketing Success, as well as the chief marketing officer at CPA firm Leander Limited. Sarah also serves as president of the Minnesota chapter of the Institute of Packaging Professionals. So Dave and Sarah, I will turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you. And thanks for giving us this opportunity. So again, a brand background, and so we'll be chatting a little bit about some of the trade-offs that come into using sustainable package or thinking about making that change. I'll handle the first couple of bullet points here and talking about how the business goals and the brand promise potentially fit with some of that decision, as well as cost considerations. And then Sarah will take the last two bullets here and bring us home. So if we think about, I guess first off, as I was thinking about my comments, going to make, they probably almost come across as sounding though I'm opposed to sustainable packaging and that it'd be a bad idea to move there. And I'm most definitely not. I'm terribly concerned about sustainability, particularly as it relates to impacts on climate change. But just in my upbringing as a brand marketer and therefore running a P&L, I always see myself as a business person and really looking at the trade-offs that you need to think seriously about in making a change to your product. And again, the comments are probably more related to somebody being in business and thinking about making a shift in their existing package. But they certainly apply to somebody who's just starting out and moving forward. So, let's think about you're running your business, right? Couple of goals there. Primarily, you're running a business to make money. That is, fundamentally the reason to be in business. At the same time, you want to do no harm in making that money. Ultimately, you perhaps want to do some good with the money you make from a social enterprise standpoint. But ultimately, if you don't make any money, you can't do those other two things. And so the considerations are pretty critical here. I've got a individual who works for me. He, as a college project, and then he started a bar business coming out of it, where he had interest in using quinoa that was growing somewhat wild in South America and being harvested or gathered, using that quinoa to make a protein bar, and ultimately wanting to give back to the people that were harvesting that product. Ultimately, though, as he starts to look at his P&L, his cost structure is such that he can't run towards that goal of creating a viable social enterprise. And so the likelihood of that product being, coming to market and being successful is frankly quite challenged, and he can't really get to that goal. Now, again, that's a social enterprise story versus something around sustainability, but I think it shows the intent of that P&L has to be functioning in order to get to some of those those other goals. So if I think about sustainable packaging and really does it fit a brand, first place I look is, what does your brand stand for? What's the brand promise and what's the positioning? Like if we think back to a classic positioning statement, which says, hey, for the target, this brand is the one brand that does something unique. And it does so because there's a reason to believe. How critical is sustainable package to delivering that benefit? If your product, is a protein shake or a energy shot, is the packaging potentially, frankly, that related in terms of being sustainable to delivering that key message or that key benefit? I think the other thing to consider is just some general priorities. So the chart on the right-hand side here is from the International Food Info Council. They do a food and health survey every year. You frankly could find this sort of chart probably in a lot of different places. And at the end of the day, right, taste is always number one. When you look at what do consumers want out of their food products that they're buying, taste has got to deliver first and foremost and across the board. Convenience and price are, they'll flip around, but second and third and certainly important. And they're often frankly table stakes, right? You've got to be competitive with the other products in the marketplace and the other alternatives. And you've got to be delivering some level of convenience, that's frankly more and more increasingly important. Sustainability or being environmentally friendly might be a tiebreaker at best. Now, if it's not, it doesn't say that you don't do it, particularly if it's important to what to what your brand promise is or what you want your business to be in terms of a reflection of yourself, particularly from an entrepreneur's standpoint. Just know that, it may not specifically drive sales by moving to that sustainable package. And ultimately, a couple other things that I think about in terms of influencing this is, who is your consumer target? Generally speaking, younger consumers being more interested in sustainability, environmental concerns than older consumers. Broad brush, not that that's not evolving, but those folks may be, it may be more important to you to head down that path depending on your consumer target. I think the other thing is thinking about what pricing is related to other products. If you've got a very small delta versus competition, it might be easier to make that change or to adopt a sustainable package if it's coming with an increased cost of goods. And then finally, thinking about that competitive set. what's everybody else in your market doing? What are they doing about their packaging? And do you need to do it to frankly be consistent and competitive in the marketplace? The other consideration that I think about is how are you going to talk to consumers about this, right? Like if we think about most food enterprises, their package is the primary vehicle by which they're able to talk about their product and talk about their messages. If you're making a change to a sustainable package, do you have the ability to communicate that in a meaningful way on pack? And one of really two ways to do that, right, is the idea of telling people about it, messages, violators, whatever on package, or letting them experience it, literally the package being a different form and function that lets them firsthand experience that something's different here, right? I mean, if we think about packaging and communication, you've sort of got that old rule of being a 5 feet away in 5 seconds in terms of communicating that benefit from a distance in the grocery store. You may need to communicate some of the benefits in other avenues, whether that's website or social. And I think, it's sort of fleeting at the point, that ability to tell that story becomes a little bit fleeting in terms of being a big story on day one. And over time, it just becomes a little bit more of the element of what the business is. And then finally, how do you make a meaningful impact? Ultimately, if you've made this change towards a sustainable product, or sustainable packaging, are you in a spot where you're doing enough volume that you feel like you're making a substantial change to the environment or to society in total? Flipping over from brand considerations, there's also the cost consideration side of just running the business, right? And so if you assume that it's going to help your business and deliver on your brand promise, the question is, how much does it impact your P&L? So again, kind of making the assumption that the package is going to cost more, because frankly, if it's not, there'd be very little reason not to move forward to a sustainable package. But you really have 3 levers to pull: volume, price, and margin. Again, from my perspective, I think about margin and assuming there's a bit of a cost there. At a minimum, you try to protect your margin on a per unit basis. So if it costs you a nickel more for that package, you've got to at least find a nickel of price increase or cost of goods reductions. The better is to protect the margin from a percentage basis, both from seeking financing long term or being able to position the business for sale at some point where someone's going to look at your margin on a percentage basis over time. What that means to that nickel is you've got to actually find more money to cover that nickel in the cost of goods in order to protect that margin. How do you do it? Potentially incremental volume. The thing with volume, it's hard to demonstrate and hard to quantify that you're going to be able to get something from a packaging change. A lot of times you'll see consumer research that'll say, hey, yeah, we're going to be able to get more volume for doing something different. It doesn't always show up in the volume in the real market. Sometimes I would question some of the academic research that goes into some of those changes versus stuff that's being done, say, like by Nielsen and Basie's study sort of approach. And then finally, pricing. And the challenge that I think about with price is that it's difficult to pass on. Right. So if again, you think back to that nickel, it's sort of the opportunity for a nickel to become a dime or something more, right? If I've got a nickel increase in my cost of goods, by the time it gets through my distributors and through the retailer taking margin, it's probably 11 or 12 cents on the shelf. And that potentially gets worse if when you take that price, the retailer potentially looks at saying, oh, well, hey, it's 11 cents. That leaves me in a place from a pricing standpoint that's not call it a normal ending price point. And your price point on shelf comes up 15 or even 20 cents. So there's a lot of risk in terms of pulling the pricing lever to offset a move towards sustainable packaging. So with that, I'll turn this over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about the actual and perceived impacts and actually going about making that change.
Sarah, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Dave. In this section, we'll be talking about actual versus perceived impact. And some of the things we want to talk about here is consumers' ability to recycle, and if there is recycling streams set up. Sometimes at restaurants, as well as home recycling, it's hard for consumers to figure out what is recyclable and what's not. It's different in a lot of restaurants based on their geography and what system is set up there. Some of the cool things I wanted to highlight in this section, there's a potato company called Wada, and they are making potato bags with potato waste. And I think that's one of the coolest things that's going on in the produce industry with packaging, is using potato waste in the potato bags. So I think that's really cool. There's also a company in Stillwater that's making forks and plates and so on that are compostable. So that's one of the recommendations that I give people when they're looking for sustainable packaging. If it's really difficult to actually change the food packaging that you have, one idea would be using that compostable silverware and plateware to sample your product when you're sampling. One of the changes that was made recently is Starbucks announced that they're removing straws from the system, and so we have a picture there of the new lid that Starbucks is using. And our household is a frequent visitor of Starbucks. My daughter really enjoys their strawberry Aussie refreshers, and so being in the packaging industry, it's kind of fun to ask the workers, what's going on with that. And it was really interesting to me that it's a positive spin on saving the turtles. Every single time that we have been there, it's like, oh, you have a new cup, you have a new lid, you're not using straws. Oh yes, we're saving the turtles. So I think that's really great how it's not about what's being removed or the negative aspects in the environment, but it's the positive spin of saving the turtles. So I thought that was really fun and a good way to think about it. So the last for this section, we thought we'd leave you with this quote: any consumer can have a car painted any color that he wants as long as it's black. So, just talking about what change you want to make and the impacts of those changes, and whether your co-packers can handle it, and just what that looks like.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah and Dave. Greatly appreciate your time and energy in putting this content together. So thank you so much. And then the third module that we're moving on to is we're going to go back to Claire. And Claire is going to talk to us a little bit about understanding the actual environmental impact of more sustainable packaging using a tool called life cycle analysis. We'll go back to Dr. Claire Sand for this module in just a second, but let me start by warning you that life cycle analysis is a little bit of a complex consideration and is something that is great for us to be able to take into account, but it's also a complex tool that requires some level of understanding of what you're getting out of it. And so Claire will help us get a better understanding of the tool and what impact it can have, so that you can factor this into your decision as it relates to understanding the actual impact of your decision to move to a more sustainable package. So Claire, I'll turn it back over to you.
Boy, Jason, that was a good warning. So thank you. Boy, it is complex. Yeah, so these are the key takeaways. When we work with companies on more sustainable packaging, we say, well, gosh, you don't want to be on Facebook or whatever social media that your packaging is not the most sustainable when you say it is. So it has to be defensible and rational, and LCAs can really help out with this. We're going to talk through some different options, but the first thing we're going to talk about are why LCAs are relevant, and then we'll go through some examples with beverages and the group picked beverages and cookies. So LCAs have been around for a while, since the 1970s, which I unfortunately remember. And they've been called various things, but basically it's a metric to measure the environmental impact. Coke bottles are shown here because really it was developed by a scientist at Coke many moons ago to quantify it and to guide Coke in making decisions. And Joel already talked about some of the impacts that we see with packaging, and life cycle analysis measures these main ones, but also some of the other ones he mentioned as well. So why is it important? One of the things we talked about UN Strategic Development Goals, you know, being able to combine all the different impacts of packaging and food. Many companies are using both to be the most sustainable. And one of the reasons that life cycle analysis is pretty relevant is that it can really be used to reinforce the brand. So if you're telling people that you have a more sustainable packaging, you can actually have facts associated with that. And it's a means to connect with consumers and enrich the lives of communities. So this is an overview of different materials. And so when Jason said it's complex, it is complex. And so these are just 3 attributes that were measured. We're going to not talk through the details of these film, but just talk through some of the different examples. So when you see the little green triangle there, that's high barrier film. It's not recyclable, but it contains 25% post-consumer recycled content, or PCR. And then the blue one has multi-layer, same structure, but only it has 25% bio-derived. So you can see, well, that makes sense because it has a higher impact on the land, right? So let's say it's a corn base. Well, it has a much higher impact on the land than just a more traditional polymer that's fossil-based. Land impact being arable land, air, soil, water, fertilizers, and things like that. This is pretty interesting. So for those of you who really want to lower your impact on your environmental impact of packaging, one of the easiest ways to do that is to get it from a very close supplier that's close by. So this is these are for different structures. So green is green. An example, if you get something regionally, this was right next to the manufacturing facility on the left where it says not shipped and 2,000 miles away. This is from an actual study we did with a company, and it shows the environmental impact. So if you buy regionally, you can decrease your environmental impact as much as about 10 to 15%, depending on the material. This shows the impact of disposing. So recycling does make an impact. This is for low density polyethylene film, kind of like bread bags. And so as we increase the amount of recycled or amount of recycling that's done with the bag, we can really decrease the environmental impact. So these are actually the sourcing and the recycled, the amount of recycling is from life cycle analyses. So that's how we can use them. So these are some of the different technologies that can be used. SEMA Pro is one on the lower right. It's extremely complex. There's like a 3-day or maybe 3-week training session on it, and it combines food waste and packaging waste. The one that's used quite a bit in the US is Compass, and that's through the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. We use the one on the upper right because we've been able to control a lot of different factors better. So let's talk about beverages. We're going to go through just a very quick life cycle analysis on different beverage options. And so if you are in the beverage category, it may look to you like, oh my gosh, there's so many choices. So we took about 4 or 5 different choices, which are on the left. You could have a plastic bottle, you can have a paper bottle, you can have a multi-layer kind of a Tetra Pak type of structure, you could have a glass bottle, or you could have a metallized pouch. And then, as Joel pointed out, you can have virgin content, recycled content, or you could even have a package that's reused. So let's look at what happens here. This is a warm-up. So we're just one LCA metric, and we're looking at climate change metric. And these show the relative life cycle impact of those different choices. It's, you know, blatant that glass is way up there. And you may say, well, gosh, glass is more sustainable. Well, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. If you're a regional supplier and you do things like reuse, like they have in Oregon, you mentioned the beer industry there, then boy, that may be the most sustainable option. But if you're relying on recycling rates, and this is current recycling rates in the United States, then it is not the most sustainable option to use. Better to use some of the other options. You may have consumers, though, that like glass bottles. Then you can say to yourself, well, we're going to reduce our environmental impact with glass bottles, and we're going to source locally if we can. Source these glass bottles locally so we don't have them shipped all over the United States to our manufacturing facility. And then maybe we'll have regional packers for our products so that we can lower the impact of using that glass. So let's talk about something that I really like to talk about, cookies, right? Let's unpack this a lot. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on this. We have a plastic bottle on the left, which we could kind of stack cookies in. We have a clear pouch there. We have something that we see a lot in the, I guess you could say the deli or short shelf life products in the middle, a PET tray. And then we have a bakery box, right, which we used to see a lot of in packaging. And then we have the metallized pouch, virgin content, recycled content, or reusable packaging. So there's a lot going on here. So the last LCA analysis, we talked only with beverages. We talked only about the one on the far left, which is the climate change ones. There are other metrics, and I've just pulled in water use and land use to give you an idea of how complex it really is. So we've got some options that are not recyclable, right? And those are the metallized pouch, right? The multi-layer barrier pouch, and the one that contains bio-derived content and the one that contains post-consumer recycled content. They're not recyclable, but everything else is recyclable. The ones that are dark or colors on the far left, so up until the red lines, are high barriers. So those provide a high degree of product protections. The one starting at the light blue, moving to the right, those provide less product protection. So that's just based on the actual barrier properties, right? So obviously a paperboard bakery box would provide less protection than a PET jar, right? So that's something to think about when we think about food waste. So if you have a product that you want national distribution, well, boy, you may need to have one of the ones that's darker on the left as opposed to the one on the right. If you have a small regional brand and you're packing product all the time, you may be fine with one of the products on the right. So when we look at this, though, there's a couple surprises, right? So we have metallized pouches being the lowest environmental impact. I think it's with all the different metrics. Well, what's going on there? We're actually using less packaging material. So when you think about the amount of packaging material in a metallized pouch, it's real thin, kind of like what we see with Sun Chips, versus a PET jar, right, which is the purple line. Makes sense, right, that we would have more environmental impact. And so what LCA studies tell us is that, well, boy, if we use just less packaging in general, right, we can make a huge environmental impact, regardless of the structure. So this is based on current US recycling rates. Well, I dream about a lot of things at night, but one of the things I dream about is 100% recycling and 100% composting. That would be totally cool, right? So this chart has no non-recyclable packaging on it, right? So if you say to yourself, we want to use recyclable packaging or compostable packaging, this is the chart. And so this is assuming 100% of the compostable packaging is compostable and is composted, and 100% of the recyclable packaging is recycled. And so these are the impacts. We also see some surprises, though. We see high amounts. If you think about the paperboard box, the bright yellow one, boy, that looks horrible, right? But that makes sense because we have trees, right? It comes from trees. just like with purple, that's a PLA-based EcoBio pouch. It also has PBAT in it, but we relied on the PLA component heavily for this analysis. And so you see a lot of land use there. So it is complex, like Jason warned you. What the metric that's most commonly used is climate change. The metric that sometimes is used, depending on the environment, for example, in an environment where it's really water starved, then water use might be more important. We're here in the land of 10,000 lakes. Well, maybe that's not the most relevant impact. Maybe we want to look at something like climate change, or if we were a landlocked country, we might want to look at land use. So number one thing, which is not even on here, LCAs are complex. They are an excellent guide, really, though, to measure the actual environmental impact. One of the ways you can really reduce your impact is to source close to where your packaging facility is, and also dispose of your materials close. So reuse, when you're having to send a product all across the country for potential reuse, doesn't really make sense from a life cycle analysis standpoint. Better to reuse it locally, with the example being the Oregon bottlers for beer. We also can use recycled content and bio-derived content, but the issue here is sometimes we have mixed results with bio-derived content because we have more land use because it's derived from biomass on land, but then we also have reduced climate impact. So it has mixed types of results. Thank you for your time.
Claire, that was great. Thank you so much. I think you did a good job of breaking down that very complex topic into something that at least makes clear that there are a lot of considerations. And I think that's ultimately what we truly wanted to get across here. So before we move into general Q&A, I'd just like to leave you, the audience, with one thought from all of these presenters, which is really that the decision that you make to use a more sustainable packaging strategy should not be taken lightly, as fit with your business model or brand promise, the cost to make the transition, and an understanding of the actual environmental impact should all be taken into account around whether or not you decide to move to that idealistic compostable package, or whether or not moving into a flexible pouch made of recyclable material might actually be a lower impact choice from an environmental point of view. So I just think that these are interesting things to be thinking about. And the purpose of today's session and today's content was really to help give you more of the tools to make a decision that takes into account a better base understanding of what that more sustainable packaging strategy should look like and what elements it needs to take into account. I'd also like to take a moment to just thank our presenters, Claire, Joel, Dave, and Sarah. Thank you for taking the time to build the content and to share your expertise with our audience. They will be available in the breakout room Q&A following our general Q&A session. And so with that, I will turn it back over to you, Allison, for any questions that you'd like to raise from the chat. And then we will be on track to go ahead and answer any of those for a few minutes. And then we will allow time to move into the breakout session. And please note that the breakout rooms will remain open, but the formal content from this primary room is now complete. So you can leave this session directly from the breakout rooms once we get there. And ultimately, we just wanted to say thank you for joining us today. So Allison, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jason, for wrapping that up. And thank you again to all the presenters. That was wonderful content and super informative. And I've seen LCAs done before. And so it is awesome to see them laid out in such a clear way. So thank you so much, Claire, for that. We've had a few questions come up during the presentations, but I believe they've actually been answered in the chat by our presenters, which is awesome. So great real-time answering of questions. If you currently have another question that you'd like to ask in the general Q&A, please type it in and we will have them answer as they can. If not, we'll leave a minute or two for people to type in questions. Otherwise, we can certainly move into the breakout rooms early. if we do not have anyone that wants to share now.
You know, Allison, I have a question. I'm sure there will be another one that comes up quickly, but I did want to ask Claire in particular. You presented life cycle analyses as a very complex tool, which I think we all understand. So how should a business think about trying to assess that impact on their product? What's the first step to take?
That's a good point. I think the first step to take is to quite simply look at your current packaging. Sometimes it's not a massive switch that you need to make. Sometimes it can be things like, gosh, where do you source it from? We just had a client that was sourcing, from 2,000 miles away from their factory, but they had a local supplier that they could have used. It was a kind of a run-of-the-mill, nothing unique about it, type of packaging material. And so sometimes just taking a step back and saying, well, gosh, can we reduce the thickness of this material? Do we, if it's a pouch, do we need to have that much air in our pouch? And sometimes you can say, well, boy, if we could reduce the amount of air in this pouch by 15%, that will save us about 5% in our actual packaging amount. And it can also save you money. And so I think it's important that people just not say, oh gosh, well, we need to make this huge change to compostable packaging or whatever. It's really important to just take a step back and look at your current packaging and kind of make those simple decisions, which, suppliers can help you out with. And then the second thing is to really think about disposal. What happens to this, right? And how can we do a better job as a brand to make sure the right thing happens to it? Of course, nobody wants people to throw straws in the ocean, right? But nobody also wants our package to end up on the roadside. So what can we do with design and creativity to make sure that if our package is recyclable, consumers actually know that, and they don't have to try to find a recycling symbol or whatever, or directions from the SPC on how to recycle it. They know it's recyclable. So I think we can do a lot with creative things with design. And then there's also the really fun material science stuff. So long answer, but hope that covered it.
You did. Thanks, Claire. Allison, are there any more questions from the chat?
We have not had any come up in the last minute or two here while Claire was giving that rundown. So it's kind of a publicly speak now or forever hold your peace on the public chat for asking questions. Otherwise, I think we might be able to move into the breakout rooms. So I'm going to have my associate Sharada, I think, send everyone off to those, and we will conclude with those breakout room sessions. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and hopefully you get your questions answered in those rooms.
Thank you, everyone.